At 2:15 in the afternoon, my father stood up in the middle of my grandfather's funeral reception, tapped a fork against a water glass until the whole diner went quiet, and told 40 mourners that I was no longer welcome behind the counter. I was holding a coffee pot in one hand and a box of my grandfather's reading glasses in the other. I'd just refilled Mrs. Okafor's cup. She'd been coming in every Tuesday since before I was born. Effective today, my father said, Danny is taking over as owner and operator of Reyes Diner. Marisol has done a fine job holding things together. But it's time for the family name to be represented by someone who actually has a vision for this place. My brother Danny stood up next to him in a suit that cost more than a month of the diner's payroll, and he had the good sense to at least look uncomfortable about it. Not uncomfortable enough to say anything. Then my father reached under the counter, my counter, the one I'd wiped down 11,000 mornings in a row, and pulled out a cardboard box. My spare apron. A photo of me and my grandfather from the diner's 30th anniversary. An extra pair of shoes I kept in the back for double shifts. You can take the rest home tonight, he said. After close. I want you to notice the specific cruelty of that sentence. After close. He wasn't even firing me all the way. He was letting me finish the shift. Grief is inconvenient for business, but so is being short-staffed on a Sunday. Now let me show you the same diner, 6 hours and 45 minutes later. 9 p.m. closing time. Same booth by the window my grandfather used to sit in with his coffee and his crossword every single morning of his life until 11 days ago. My brother Danny stands at the register, ready to run the nightly closeout he has never once, in his life, actually performed. He punches in his employee code. Access denied. He tries again. Access denied. The walk-in cooler keypad, locked out. The supplier ordering portal, password rejected. And in my car in the parking lot, headlights off, I watch a single confirmation land on my phone, one I had scheduled myself 9 hours earlier, standing in a bathroom stall with my grandfather's reading glasses still in my hand. All Reyes Diner systems, trustee override complete. At 2:15 that afternoon, my father stood in the diner my grandfather built with his own 2 hands and told a room full of mourners that I was staff being let go. What he never bothered to learn, because it never once occurred to him to ask, was that 2 years before my grandfather died, the deed, the LLC, the registers, and every single system that runs that diner had already stopped answering to him. They gave me a cardboard box at 2:15. I gave them a dark register at 9. Before I tell you how a fork against a water glass turned into the quietest lockout this family has ever felt, if anyone has ever tried to fire you from something you built, from something you were grieving in the same breath, hit the like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one. And answer me this before you know how it ends. Are you a keys person or a ledger person? One word. You'll understand exactly what I mean by minute 20. My name is Marisol Reyes. I'm 37 years old. And for the better part of 15 years, my family believed I was exactly what my father called me at that reception. Staff. The daughter who never left. The one who just never figured out what she wanted to do, as my mother liked to put it at every holiday gathering, usually 2 glasses of wine into the evening. Here's what they saw. A woman who came back from culinary school at 22 to help her grandfather for just one summer and never quite left. A manager's name tag she wore because nobody else wanted the early shift. A daughter who lived in the apartment above the diner because it was convenient, not because it was, for years, the only rent she could actually afford, while every spare dollar went back into a business that wasn't legally hers. My brother Danny got the story everyone in this family actually wanted to tell. Business degree, corner office at a marketing firm downtown, a wife named Britt who introduced him at parties as in family enterprise, which was a generous way of describing a man who visited the diner maybe 6 times a year, usually to ask for a loan. And behind both of them, steady as a metronome, was my father, Hector Reyes. A man who had inherited his own father's name and precisely none of his father's instincts, and who had spent 30 years quietly resenting a diner he never once had to run. Now here's what was true. The diner's building, the land underneath it, the walk-in cooler, the registers, the supplier accounts, the LLC that actually holds every asset the business touches, none of it belonged to my father, and none of it belonged to Danny. 2 years before he died, my grandfather sat me down in the back office on a Tuesday after close and told me he was restructuring the trust that owned everything. Not the diner's day-to-day operating account, the one my father's name sat on for tax purposes because my grandfather thought that would keep the peace. The actual assets. The dirt. The walls. The name on the sign. He named me sole trustee. He named himself the settler until his death, at which point control would pass to me completely, automatically, with no probate delay and no family vote required. Your father will make noise, he told me, in that same back office, sliding a folder across a desk sticky with 50 years of coffee rings. Let him make noise at a diner he doesn't own. It won't reach very far. I never told Danny. I never told my father. I never even told my mother, because my grandfather asked me not to, and because some quiet, stubborn part of me suspected correctly, as it turned out, that this exact day was coming, and I wanted to see, clearly, without anyone performing for an audience, exactly how my family would treat me if they believed the diner was never going to be mine. I remember the exact way he said it, sliding that folder across the desk. I watched your father let this place run him instead of the other way around for 30 years, Mari. I'm not doing that to you. I'm doing the opposite. I'm making sure this place answers to the person who actually gets up at 5 in the morning for it. I laughed at the time, half out of nerves. He didn't laugh back. He just tapped the folder once, the way he tapped a ticket rail when an order was ready, and said, sign it or don't. But it's already true either way. There's one more thing they didn't know. For the past 4 years, alongside running the floor, I had been quietly consulting nights and weekends for 2 other family-owned restaurant groups across the state, helping them modernize their back-of-house systems on contracts I signed under my full legal name, invoiced through an LLC of my own that had absolutely nothing to do with Reyes Diner. It wasn't glamorous work. It was steady. And it was mine, and after 4 years it had built into a retainer worth more, annually, than my father's entire visible income. So when I tell you what happened at 2:15 that afternoon, understand exactly what my father believed he was discarding, a 37-year-old woman with a name tag and a box of borrowed shoes. And understand what he was actually discarding, his landlord. My grandfather died on a Tuesday morning in the same back booth where he'd done the diner's books for 50 years, mid-sentence, a pencil still in his hand. I was the one who found him. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters for everything that comes after. I was the one who found him, and I was also, apparently, the one who could be publicly fired 11 days later in the same room. The funeral was on a Sunday. The reception afterward was held at the diner itself, because where else would you hold it? The man had spent more waking hours inside those 4 walls than inside his own house. We closed for the day, pushed the tables together, and I spent the morning doing what I've always done in that building during a crisis. I made coffee, I plated food, I kept my hands busy so my chest wouldn't cave in. My father experienced that same morning as a stage he'd been waiting to walk out onto. He'd been distant with grief in the way some men perform distance, the heavy sighs, the long silences at exactly the moments people were watching. Danny had flown in 2 days earlier, in time for the funeral, not in time for anything that came before it. Britt arrived in a black dress that had clearly never touched a diner counter in its life, and spent the morning taking photos of the flower arrangements for reasons I still don't fully understand. I didn't argue with any of it. I was too tired, and honestly, I had a suspicion building in my chest that I hadn't let myself name yet. My grandfather's attorney had called me the week before, gently, to schedule a reading, and something about the careful way she'd phrased it told me the trust was finally coming due. I thought, hold the line, get through today, let them believe whatever keeps them calm until the paperwork speaks for itself. I want to be honest with you about that. I wasn't quiet at that reception because I was weak. I was quiet because I was waiting, and there's a specific kind of woman families like mine consistently misread. They think the quiet is surrender. The quiet is inventory. At 2 p.m., 40-some mourners were scattered through the booths, working through trays of the exact sandwiches my grandfather used to make for the Rotary Club lunches. I was behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, when I noticed my father stand up and lean toward Danny, murmuring something. Danny nodded, adjusted his jacket, and did not look at me. You know how a diner feels a storm before it hits? A daughter feels a fork against a water glass in her sleep. My father stood, cleared his throat, and asked for everyone's attention. I remember thinking, absurdly, that he was going to give a eulogy. He hadn't given one at the service that morning. Maybe, I thought, grief had finally caught up to him. It hadn't. I want to thank everyone for being here for my father, he began, and it was, briefly, a normal thing to say. Then his eyes found me, over by the coffee station, and something in his voice changed register entirely, the way a man's voice changes when he's rehearsed the next part in a mirror. Effective today, Danny is taking over as owner and operator of Reyes Diner. Marisol has done a fine job holding things together. A pause timed. But it's time for the family name to be represented by someone who actually has a vision for this place. I looked at Danny. I gave him the one look every overworked sibling gives the golden child in that exact moment, the look that says, correct him. Say something. This is the moment. Danny looked at his shoes. My father reached under my counter, and pulled out a cardboard box I hadn't noticed him plant there sometime that morning while I was in the kitchen. My spare apron. A photograph of me and my grandfather from the diner's 30th anniversary, the two of us laughing at something the camera never caught. An extra pair of non-slip shoes I kept in the back office for double shifts. You can take the rest home tonight, he said, loud enough for Mrs. Okafor at table 4 to stop chewing entirely. After close. I remember the specific silence that followed. Not shocked silence, worse. The silence of 40 people recalculating, in real time, whether to say something or eat their sandwich and pretend they hadn't heard it. Britt took a photograph of the flower arrangement nearest her. I have never once forgiven her for that photograph, though I recognize she'll never understand why. I want to tell you I said something devastating in that moment. I didn't. I set the coffee pot down, very carefully, because my hands were shaking and I did not want to give my father the satisfaction of a dropped pot on the day we buried his own father. I said, okay, and I picked up a tray of empty plates and I kept working, because someone had to, and because I had 11 minutes of math already running quietly in the back of my head. One of the servers, a woman named Carol who'd worked the floor with me for 9 years, caught my elbow on my way to the kitchen and whispered, Mari, do you want me to say something? I told her no. I told her the truth, actually, that I needed exactly 1 more hour of nobody saying anything at all, and that she could help me most by simply keeping the coffee moving. She did. Carol refilled cups for the rest of that reception like it was the most important job in the world, and in a lot of ways, that day it was. The reception ended at 4. I finished the closing prep like I always did. And somewhere around 6, in the single-stall bathroom by the kitchen, with the door locked and my grandfather's reading glasses still sitting in my apron pocket where I'd tucked them without thinking, I opened my phone and pulled up the trust portal my grandfather's attorney had walked me through 11 days earlier. Every system the diner touched, the point-of-sale registers, the walk-in cooler's smart keypad, the supplier ordering accounts, the payroll platform, ran through one master administrative login, set up quietly by my grandfather's IT-savvy nephew 4 years ago when the diner finally modernized. I want you to understand this wasn't a secret weapon I'd built for revenge. It was just how the business had run for 4 years. My father had simply never once logged in to check. I scheduled the override for 9 p.m. closing time. Not out of cruelty, out of precision. I wanted my father and my brother to run one final, ordinary Sunday, exactly like every other Sunday, so there would be no ambiguity later about who had actually been operating that diner the whole time. Let them close it out themselves. Let the system simply, quietly, stop recognizing them at the exact hour the day was supposed to end. I don't know how long I stood in that bathroom. The trust portal logs it as 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It felt considerably longer. When I came out, most of the mourners had gone. I gathered my box, my apron, the photograph, the shoes, and I walked out the back door into the parking lot because I could not, that day, walk out through the dining room where my father was still shaking hands like a man who'd just closed a good deal. A car door opened before I'd even reached mine. Priya Chandra, 61 years old. My grandfather's accountant for 25 years, and though almost nobody in my family had bothered to remember this, his personal friend since long before I was born. She'd left the reception an hour earlier, she told me later, specifically because she'd overheard my father rehearsing something in the parking lot before the reception even started, and had a very bad feeling about what it might be. She took one look at the box in my arms and the state of my face and said, "Get in the car." I don't know how long we sat there. She didn't ask me anything at first. She just let the heater run and handed me a tissue from the glove box, unceremoniously, the way you hand someone a tool they clearly need. "He fired me," I finally said. In front of everyone. At the reception. Priya was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've turned over in my head 100 times since. "Marisol, did your grandfather ever tell you exactly what he changed 2 years ago, or did he just tell you it was changed?" I told her what I knew: trustee, sole control, automatic transfer on death. She nodded slowly, like a woman confirming a number she'd already calculated privately. "I filed the amended trust documents myself," she said. "I've been waiting for your father to find out the hard way, because your grandfather asked me, specifically, not to be the one to tell him early." She looked at the diner through the windshield, lights still on inside, my father's silhouette moving between tables. He's about to run his first and only shift as a man who thinks he owns that building. I'd let him finish it. That was Priya's entire instruction. Let him finish it. She didn't tell me to storm back in. She didn't tell me to say anything at all. She told me the exact opposite of everything my chest was screaming at me to do. "Don't call your mother tonight," she added. "Don't post anything. Don't explain yourself to a single person in that dining room." A man who plants a box under a counter before a funeral reception even starts isn't grieving, he's executing something he planned. And men who execute plans always think they're the only ones allowed to have one. She drove me to her own house that night, made me a cup of tea I didn't finish, and left the porch light on for as long as I needed it. And around 8:50, sitting on her back steps with my grandfather's reading glasses still in my pocket, I let myself cry. Once. Hard, quiet, ugly, the kind where you press your own sleeve against your mouth so the sound doesn't carry. I gave it about 11 minutes. It felt, oddly, like the correct length. Then I wiped my face, opened my laptop on Priya's kitchen table, and watched the clock climb toward 9. I want to walk you through exactly what happened at 9 o'clock, because people imagine a moment like this as loud. It wasn't. It was a checkbox interface at 8:58 p.m., refreshed twice by a woman drinking lukewarm tea at someone else's kitchen table. At 8:58, Danny began his first ever nightly close, my father hovering behind him with the specific pride of a man watching his son perform a task neither of them had ever once actually learned. The cameras I'd had installed 2 years earlier, for insurance purposes, officially, though I'll admit I'm no longer entirely sure that was my only reason, were still syncing quietly to the same cloud account they always had. Nobody had thought to ask whose name was on that account either. 8:58 and 40 seconds p.m. Danny opens the register drawer to start the count. Fine. That part still worked. Cash drawers don't need a login. 9 o'clock p.m. sharp. Somewhere in a server the diner had been quietly paying $11 a month for since 2021. 3 administrative accounts lose their access simultaneously. 9:02 p.m. Danny tries to run the nightly sales report. Access denied. He blinks at the screen, tries again. Same result. He calls my father over. My father, who has never once in his adult life logged into a point-of-sale system, tries his own credentials, the ones tied to the payroll account he technically sits on for tax purposes, and gets the exact same wall. 9:06 p.m. The walk-in cooler's smart keypad, installed the same year as the cameras, stops accepting the 6-digit code the entire kitchen staff has used for 2 years. Danny stands in the back hallway punching numbers into a keypad with the specific fury of a man who has never once had a system say no to him. 9:11 p.m. My father calls the diner's longtime supplier rep, trying to place tomorrow's produce order through the portal on his phone. Login rejected. The rep, a woman named Dolores who's sold this family bell peppers for 11 years, tells him gently that the account shows a different administrator on file, and she isn't authorized to make changes over the phone. I watched all of this live from Priya's kitchen table, eating dry toast, because it was the only thing in her cupboard I had the appetite for. 9:20 p.m. My father calls me. I let it ring 4 times before I answered, not for drama, because Priya had her hand on my wrist, steady, and mouthed the word breathe. Marisol. His voice had a wobble in it I had genuinely never heard before. The systems are down. Danny can't close the register. Did you do something? I said the only sentence I'd prepared. Check the trust documents, Dad. Priya has copies if you don't. There was a long silence on the line. Then, what trust documents? I hung up. I want to be precise about why, not to be cruel, but because I had already learned, over 15 years in that family, that explaining myself to my father in the moment he was panicking never once produced anything but more panic aimed back at me. Let the paperwork talk. The paperwork had been very patient. It could wait one more night. 9:41 p.m. The diner's night manager, a 22-year-old named Tobias, who'd worked under me for 3 years, texted me a single photo, my father and Danny standing in the middle of a dark dining room, both still in their funeral clothes, staring at a register screen that would not open. Underneath it, Tobias had typed, "Should I lock up? I don't have a key that isn't yours." I told him yes. Lock up. Go home. I'll see him Tuesday. They put a cardboard box in my arms at 2:15. Their registers stopped answering at 9. That's 6 hours and 45 minutes. People in the comments will tell me I should have waited. I want to be honest with you. I have never regretted the timing. A man shows you exactly who he is with a fork against a water glass. Believe him by closing time. But I need to stop the quiet satisfaction right here, because 2 days later, while my father was still leaving voicemails I hadn't returned, something changed that had nothing to do with the diner at all. My grandmother, Nell, my grandfather's wife of 52 years, has mild dementia. Manageable, mostly, on a careful routine, a memory care day program 3 mornings a week, a home care aide the other 2, and me, most evenings, sitting with her while she watched the same rerun of a cooking show she no longer remembered having seen the night before. The day program and the home care aide had been quietly paid, for the past 3 years, through a small consulting line on the diner's payroll. Nell reviewed recipes, officially. A fiction my grandfather set up so her care would run through the business's health coverage instead of draining her own modest savings. It wasn't fraud. It was a decision he'd made with his own accountant, fully documented. It was also, as of 9 p.m. 2 nights earlier, sitting inside a payroll system my father could no longer access, and, apparently, one he was now willing to weaponize. On Wednesday morning, the day program called me. Nell's coverage had been flagged inactive. A family member had called the previous afternoon requesting her removed from the diner's payroll roll, effective immediately, citing restructuring. Read that again with me. My father couldn't access a single register in that building. But he could still make one phone call, using a name that still technically sat on a piece of paper somewhere, and try to strip his own mother's care coverage out from under her, 2 days after burying his father, specifically because he'd guessed correctly that it was the fastest way to make me feel something. I called the program director myself. I explained the payroll transition was being handled and asked her to hold Nell's spot for 48 hours while I sorted it. She was kind about it, but she was also very clear. Without confirmed payment, they had a wait list, and the wait list doesn't wait for family drama. I sat in my car outside that day program, engine off, and felt something in me go very still and very cold, colder, honestly, than anything my father had said to me across that diner counter. He hadn't just tried to hurt me. He'd reached for the one person in this entire mess who had never done a single thing to deserve being caught in it. I thought, sitting there, about every Sunday dinner my grandmother had quietly hosted for 40 years, every plate she'd kept warm for a son who showed up late, every excuse she'd made for him at every holiday I could remember. None of that history seemed to weigh anything at all against a spreadsheet line he wanted gone. I called Priya. I told her what happened. There was a pause on the line, and then, in the flattest voice I'd heard from her yet, she said, "Get me every document tied to that payroll line. Today." Because a man who will use his own mother's medical coverage as leverage isn't having a bad week. He's telling you exactly how far he's willing to go, and I want it in writing before he remembers to be embarrassed about it. I moved Nell onto my own private health plan within 4 hours, backdated with a supplemental payment the program accepted gratefully. She never missed a single session. She will likely never know how close she came to it, and I intend to keep it that way. MIDCTA 2400 hours. If you've made it this far, this is the halfway point, and it gets colder before it gets fair. Do me one favor. If using a grandmother's medical coverage as a pressure tactic is the most calculated thing you've heard all week, type premeditated in the comments. I want to see how many of us recognize a plan dressed up as grief. Priya came to my apartment above the diner 2 nights later with her laptop and a face I'd learned, over the past week, to take very seriously. "There's something you need to see," she said. "And I want you sitting down for it because I don't think this is about pride anymore. I think this was always about money." Here's what she'd found. 8 months before my grandfather died, 8 months, not 8 days, Danny had taken a meeting with a regional development group called Harlow Crest Partners. The group specializes in exactly one thing: buying up aging commercial corners in walkable neighborhoods, demolishing whatever's on them, and building 4-story, mixed-use developments with a coffee chain on the ground floor. The diner sits on a corner like that. Danny had met with Harlow Crest's acquisitions lead 3 separate times, the emails showed, always careful never to mention his father or his sister by name, always describing himself, in writing, as a principal stakeholder in the family's commercial real estate. He'd shared square footage. He'd shared parking capacity. He'd shared, in one email dated 6 weeks before my grandfather's death, an estimated timeline for transition of ownership, as though my grandfather's mortality had already been penciled into somebody's spreadsheet. Britt was CC'd on 4 of those emails. In one, replying to a question about zoning variances, she'd written, "Once Danny's officially running things, this moves fast. His dad's basically already handed him the keys." I read that sentence 3 times. His dad's basically already handed him the keys. They'd been so certain of a story that was never legally true that they'd started selling the building underneath it before anyone had actually died. There was more. Priya had pulled the diner's operating account statements going back 2 years, the account my father's name still sat on, the one that funded day-to-day payroll and supplies, and found a pattern that had nothing to do with flour or bacon. Personal charges. A country club renewal. 2 golf trips. A consulting retainer, paid monthly to Danny for work nobody on staff could identify a single instance of him actually doing. Your father's been quietly draining the operating account for 2 years, Priya said. Not enormous amounts. Careful amounts. The kind designed to stay under a number nobody bothers questioning. She turned the laptop toward me. And your grandfather knew. He flagged 3 of these transactions himself, 11 months ago, in a note to me. He never confronted your father about it directly. I think by then he'd already decided the trust would say what he no longer had the energy to say out loud. I sat with that for a long moment. My grandfather hadn't just protected the diner from my father's incompetence. He'd protected it, very specifically and very quietly, from being sold out from under his own name before his casket was even in the ground. One more thing, Priya said, and this was the part that actually made my hands go cold. Danny sent Harlow Crest a follow-up email 4 days ago, the day after the funeral. Subject line, ownership confirmed, ready to proceed. 4 days ago, the day after we buried my grandfather. Before the reception where he stood next to my father and let him hand me a cardboard box, Danny had already told a development company the sale was moving forward, based on an ownership claim that had never, not for one single day, actually been true. For the next 4 days, Priya's dining room became exactly what you'd imagine. 2 laptops, a whiteboard covered in her small, precise handwriting, and a growing folder labeled, without any irony either of U.S. intended, evidence. I brought 15 years of my own archive to the table, every supplier invoice I'd personally approved, every payroll run I'd personally processed, every maintenance record for a walk-in cooler and a griddle and a dozen other pieces of equipment that had, at one point or another, needed my signature and nobody else's. My grandfather used to tease me for keeping paper copies of everything the cloud already stored. You archive napkins like they're deeds, Mari. I did, Grandpa. I really did. Priya brought 25 years of professional instinct for exactly one specific skill, knowing precisely where a man hides the numbers he doesn't want anyone reading twice. She worked mostly in silence those 4 nights, glasses pushed up into her hair, cross-referencing statement after statement against invoices I'd kept, occasionally muttering a date out loud like she was confirming an alibi. Around midnight on the second night, she sat back, took her glasses off entirely, and said, "You know what the strange part is? None of this was even clever. He wasn't hiding it from a forensic eye. He was hiding it from a family that never once asked to see a statement." That sentence stuck with me longer than almost anything else that week. And my father's numbers were hiding in plain sight. Between the country club renewal, the golf trips, and Danny's phantom consulting retainer, the operating account had bled just under $31,000 over 2 years. Money that should have gone toward the walk-in cooler repair I'd been quietly financing out of my own consulting income for the past 8 months, because the official account never seemed to have room for it. Then Priya found the part that turned this from embarrassing into something closer to fraud. To make the Harlow Crest deal look clean on paper, Danny had drafted and gotten my father to sign, 11 days before the funeral, while my grandfather was in his final hospital stay, a document titled Confirmation of Family Ownership Structure, asserting that the diner's real estate was held jointly by Hector and Danny Reyes, with no mention of any trust, any LLC, or any second family member whatsoever. They had signed a document claiming ownership of a building that legally belonged to me, while my grandfather was dying in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, specifically so a development company would feel comfortable moving forward with a sale. "When this comes out," Priya said, tapping the document once, "even your mother won't be able to unsee it. This isn't grief making people say ugly things at a bad moment. This is a paper trail." There was one more name in the file I have to tell you about, because it's the part people always ask me about afterward, my mother. She showed up at Priya's door on the 4th night, having tracked me there through Tobias, already reciting the talking points my father had clearly rehearsed with her in the car. I was cold. I was punishing a grieving family. I was always the difficult one, a phrase she'd used about me at approximately every family gathering since I was 14. Priya didn't argue with her. She's smarter than that. She sat my mother down, put the ownership confirmation document in her lap next to the Harlow Crest emails, and said one sentence, "Read the date on this signature line out loud, and then tell me again who's been lying to whom." I watched 30 years of family narrative fold up quietly in my mother's face. It isn't satisfying to witness, in case you're wondering. It looks like grief, because underneath everything else, it is. She read the signature date, 11 days before the funeral, and looked up at me, and the first thing she said wasn't an apology. "He told me Danny already had the deed transferred. He told me it was just paperwork left to finalize." He'd been lying to his own wife about the same fiction he'd been building for Harlow Crest. My mother agreed, quietly, to say nothing at Sunday dinner and wait. Given what it costs the wife to outwait her own husband of 40 years, I understood, watching her leave that night, that it was the bravest thing anyone in that family had done for me in a very long time. They came for me on the 5th morning at the Memory Care Day program at 9 o'clock sharp, because apparently even an ambush runs on my father's idea of a schedule. I heard my father's voice through the glass doors before I saw him, arguing with the front desk about visitor policy, flanked by an attorney in a gray suit and a woman in a lanyard I didn't recognize, holding a clipboard. Adult Protective Services. My father had filed an emergency petition alleging that Nell was being financially exploited and socially isolated by an unauthorized family member, me, and requesting immediate emergency guardianship be transferred to him, pending review. My father's opening move was theater. He crossed the room toward my grandmother, who had not seen him in 11 days, who lit up, confused and delighted, at the sight of any familiar face, and said, loud enough for the caseworker to hear every word, "Mom, it's okay, I'm here now. I'm not going to let anyone keep you from your family." I stepped between them, gently, the way you'd redirect a toddler rather than confront a grown man. "Don't upset her." That was exactly the cue he wanted. He spun to the caseworker. "You see this? She's controlling. She's been isolating my mother for weeks, hiding her financial information, and now she's blocking me from even speaking to her." The caseworker introduced herself, professional, careful, and laid out the complaint. An anonymous report alleging Nell's care and finances were being mismanaged by an unrelated party without legal authority. Could I provide documentation of my relationship to Nell and any financial authority I held on her behalf? Here's where I want you to understand the trap inside the trap. I could have ended this in 30 seconds, one screen showing the trust, the medical power of attorney my grandfather had quietly arranged alongside it 2 years earlier, naming me, specifically, as Nell's backup healthcare proxy. But the guardianship investigation, if it went forward on my father's terms, would take weeks to formally close even after being dismissed, weeks during which Nell's routine, the single most protective thing in her entire life right now, would be disrupted by strangers asking her questions she could no longer reliably answer. So I didn't perform outrage. I answered plainly. I'm her granddaughter. I hold healthcare proxy, established 2 years ago by my grandfather, her legal spouse, while he was alive and fully competent. I can have the documents to you within the hour. My father's attorney tried to interject. The caseworker held up a hand, the universal gesture of a professional who has clearly done this dance before, and said the sentence that ended my father's mourning on the spot. "Sir, if there's an existing, properly executed healthcare proxy naming this individual, filed while the prior spouse was competent, that supersedes an emergency petition from an adult child. I'll need to see it, but if it's valid, there's no basis for guardianship review today." My father's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do before, a kind of public arithmetic, recalculating in real time how badly this had gone. He caught me by the parking lot afterward, alone this time, his attorney already halfway to the car. And this is the last real conversation I've had with my father, so I'll give it to you as close to word for word as I can. He pressed a folded check into my jacket pocket, the way you'd slip something to someone you were slightly ashamed to be seen handing it to. $8,000. Take this, he said, quiet, almost gentle, the voice he used to use when he wanted something without having to ask directly. Sign a release on the diner. Walk away clean. You clearly don't need the money, fine. But this family doesn't need the lawyers, and neither do you. Take it, disappear from the paperwork, and we can all go back to being a family. I looked at that check for a long moment. Then I did the thing I'm proudest of in this entire story. I said nothing. I let my eyes go a little wet. I can produce that on command now. It's simply a skill I've acquired, and I nodded, small, like a woman considering it. I folded my hand over the check the way you'd fold your hand over something precious. Then I got in my car, took out my phone, and photographed that check, front and back, next to that morning's dated newspaper on my passenger seat. Exhibit, as it turned out, number 11. He thought he was buying my silence. He was funding his own cross-examination. Dad, hold that thought until Friday. The trust contest hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 10 a.m., in a small probate courtroom that smelled like old carpet and older paper. My father had filed to challenge the trust amendment itself, claiming undue influence, that I had somehow manipulated a dying man into signing away a business he'd spent his life building for his actual son. They arrived like a family that had rehearsed looking united. My father in his one good suit. Danny beside him, jaw tight, clearly aware by now of exactly how much of the Harlow Crest situation had surfaced. Britt, notably, was not in the gallery. My mother sat 2 rows back, alone, and did not sit beside my father. That told me everything I needed to know before a single exhibit was entered. Their attorney went first, and he did exactly what we needed him to do, committed, loudly and on the record, to the entire fiction. A grieving, elderly man manipulated in his final years by a granddaughter positioned to benefit. A hard-working son unfairly stripped of his birthright. The centerpiece, my father, a lifelong steward of his father's legacy, betrayed by the very family member he trusted to run the counter. The judge turned to me. Ms. Reyes, your response. My attorney stood, and Priya sat beside me, folder open, steady as she'd been every single day since the parking lot. Your Honor will be brief, because nearly everything you've just heard can be disproven with dates. Exhibit 1. The original trust amendment, executed 2 years prior, witnessed by 2 independent parties unrelated to either side of this family, alongside a signed capacity evaluation from Mr. Reyes's own longtime physician, confirming full mental competence at the time of signing. This was not a deathbed decision, Your Honor. It predates the decedent's terminal diagnosis by 14 months. Exhibit 2. The point of sale and access logs from the diner systems showing an unbroken administrative chain running through my credentials for 4 consecutive years, the actual, provable operator of record, regardless of whose name sat on a tax filing. Exhibit 3. Danny's emails with Harlow Crest Partners, read into the record in full. Once Danny's officially running things, this moves fast. His dad's basically already handed him the keys. My attorney let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. Petitioner's son was actively negotiating the demolition and sale of this property 8 months before the decedent's death, Your Honor, based on an ownership claim that was never once legally accurate. Exhibit 4. The confirmation of family ownership structure, signed by both petitioners 11 days before the funeral, while the decedent lay in hospice care, asserting sole ownership with no mention of the trust either man had, by that point, been formally notified existed. The judge read this one silently first. Then she read it aloud, slowly, for the court reporter. The room went very still. Exhibit 5. 2 years of operating account statements, walking the court through country club dues, golf trip charges, and a monthly consulting retainer paid to Danny for work no staff member on record could describe a single instance of. Priya, sworn in as an expert witness, delivered this part like a woman reading an autopsy report she'd written herself. Approximately $31,000 diverted from operating funds over 24 months, Your Honor, documented, dated, and never disclosed to the trustee whose funds they technically were. She walked the judge through each transaction on a printed ledger, tab by tab, never once raising her voice, never once editorializing beyond the numbers themselves. I watched my father's attorney try twice to interrupt the pattern of it and get overruled both times, because there is very little room to argue with a woman reading dates off a bank statement in the exact order they occurred. Exhibits 6 and 7. The healthcare proxy for Nell Reyes, executed the same day as the trust amendment and the day program's intake report, timestamped the previous Wednesday, showing a call from Hector Reyes requesting her coverage be terminated, 48 hours after being formally locked out of the diner's payroll system. Petitioner attempted to weaponize his own mother's medical coverage as leverage against the respondent 3 days into this dispute. Exhibit 8. The folded check, front and back, photographed beside a dated newspaper, alongside my father's own voicemail, subpoenaed from his carrier, in which he could be heard saying, clearly, "Take it, disappear from the paperwork." Petitioner attempted to purchase the respondent's silence 4 days before this hearing, Your Honor. Petitioner's attorney requested a recess. The judge declined. And then she ruled, and I've replayed her words enough times since to have them close to verbatim. In my years on this bench, I have rarely seen a challenge constructed on a foundation this thoroughly contradicted by its own paper trail. The petition to invalidate the trust amendment is denied in full. Trusteeship remains with the respondent, as executed. This court is additionally referring the matter of diverted operating funds and the signed ownership misrepresentation provided to a third-party developer for further investigation, including whether that misrepresentation constitutes attempted fraud. And Mr. Reyes, she looked at my father over her glasses, you filed an emergency guardianship petition against a woman holding valid healthcare proxy 4 days after attempting to strip your own mother of her medical coverage. Whatever else this family resolves privately, that fact will follow this proceeding. The gavel came down. Danny caught me near the elevator, because men like Danny always need the final scene. There was nothing performative left in his face by then, just a kind of flat exhaustion. The diner, he said. Dad's name has been on the operating account for 30 years. People know him. What happens to him now? 3 days of exhibits. A grandmother's stripped medical coverage. And his closing argument was his father's reputation. I looked at him for a long moment and gave him the only line I'd prepared. Check the register logs. They'll tell you exactly who's been running that diner the whole time. The elevator doors closed. It has remained, to this day, the entire conversation. So here's where everyone lands. No reunion arc. No redemption speeches. Just consequences, filed the way Priya files everything, alphabetically, and without sentiment. My father. The referral reached the district attorney's fraud division, and the $31,000, once documented, was the easy part. The Harlow Crest ownership misrepresentation was harder to walk away from. The development group quietly withdrew from the deal within a week, citing changed circumstances, and their attorney sent a letter making clear they had no interest in being associated with a fraud investigation. My father no longer has any formal role at the diner. He's welcome to eat there. He hasn't yet. Danny. Harlow Crest's acquisitions lead never called him back. The marketing firm downtown, once the fraud referral became a matter of local record, quietly restructured his role into something with considerably less client contact. Britt filed for divorce 9 weeks later. I have no particular feelings about that. It was never really my story to have feelings about. My mother and I talk most Sundays now. Not at the diner, somewhere neutral, a coffee shop 2 blocks over, her choice. We're careful with each other. It isn't fixed. It's honest, which I've learned is a different, slower kind of repair. Priya. She still handles the books, same as always, except now there's a second name on the trustee documents alongside mine, added the week after the hearing, at my insistence, because some debts you pay forward instead of back. Her signature sits 2 lines below where my grandfather's used to. My grandmother, Nell, still goes to her program 3 mornings a week, still watches the same rerun most evenings, and has, as far as I can tell, no memory whatsoever of the 5 days her care nearly became a bargaining chip. I intend to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. The diner. We're open every day but Monday, same as we've always been. I repainted the back office my grandfather worked out of, my choice this time, a soft yellow he never would have picked, because I've decided I'm allowed a sense of humor about all of this too. The booth by the window, the one he sat in every morning with his coffee and his crossword, stays reserved. Nobody sits there. It isn't a rule I wrote down anywhere. The regulars just know. Some mornings, unlocking that door at 6, I still expect to hear his pencil tapping against the counter, working out a crossword clue he'd refuse to let me help with. I don't think that feeling goes away, and I've stopped waiting for it to. Grief and ownership turned out to share more architecture than I expected. Both of them are just a matter of who keeps showing up after everyone else has decided the story is over. Because here's the moral, and then I'll let you go. A family name on a building means nothing if nobody's actually maintaining the building. Ownership was never about who talks the loudest at a reception. It's about who shows up quietly for 15 years, long before anyone thinks to check whose signature is actually on the deed. My father believed a diner made him powerful because his own father's name was on the sign. It didn't. Access is just a list someone maintains, and someone is always maintaining it. Be careful whose name you erase from your life over a fork against a water glass. Check first whose signature is actually holding the whole thing up. They handed me a cardboard box at 2:15. Their registers went dark at 9. And every single morning since, I unlock that door myself at 6 a.m. and I pour the first cup of coffee in a diner that has never, for one single day since my grandfather built it, belonged to anyone who didn't actually show up. So now you know what the words meant. Tell me in the comments one word, keys. Would you have shut off their access at closing, exactly like I did? Or ledger, would you have waited and let the paperwork do it slower in front of a judge? Be honest, because your answer says something about what's been done to you. If this story held you for 50 minutes, the like button is right there. Subscribe for the next one. It involves a hospice bed, a home security app, and a stepson who should have checked whose name was actually on the mortgage. And until then, keep your own name on your own locks.